There's a promise you've made before. Maybe last night. You told yourself tomorrow. When they push that button, the partner, the kid, the coworker who knows exactly where it is, you won't snap. You'll stay calm. You felt it land in your chest, clean and certain. You meant it completely. And then it happened. They said the thing. And before you decided anything, before the calm thought could even form, the sharp words were already out of your mouth. Same tone, same face, same you. As if the promise had never existed. Here's what almost no one tells you about that moment. You didn't fail. You were overruled. Something beneath your conscious mind reached the decision first, then handed it up to you already finished and let you believe it was your own idea. That something beneath is not a mood, and it isn't weakness. It is a specific mechanism, a subconscious process that decides, reacts, and chooses a half second before the you that calls itself you ever arrives. And here is the strange part. Almost every serious attempt to understand human behavior across spirituality, psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience eventually collided with this exact mechanism. They simply never realized they had all found the same thing. So each of them gave it a different name. In 1983, a scientist finally caught it in the act on an instrument, in a quiet lab in San Francisco. But he wasn't the first to find it. He was only the first to find it with a machine. His name was Benjamin Libet. He asked people to do one simple thing: flex your wrist, whenever you feel like it. No schedule, no instruction. Just wait for the urge, then move. And he measured their brains while they waited. The brain began preparing to move a buildup of electrical activity called the readiness potential. A full half second before the person reported any conscious intention to move. The brain decided. Then the person decided. The conscious I was not the author of the action. It received the memo after the order had already gone out. Not dramatic, not mystical, but real. Libet spent the rest of his career trying to reconcile this with free will, and never fully did. And in 2008, a team at the Max Planck Institute pushed it further. Using fMRI, they could predict the outcome of a decision from brain activity up to 7 seconds before it entered the person's awareness. 7 seconds. The brain had already chosen. The person simply hadn't been told yet. Here is the part most people miss. What Libet found was not an exception. It was a mechanism. And that mechanism had already been described with extraordinary precision by 5 separate minds, across 5 different eras, in 5 different languages. None of them had an fMRI machine. None had heard of the readiness potential. Most never knew the others had lived. And every one of them said the same thing. Neville Goddard, writing in 1944, called it the law of assumption. Carl Jung, in the 1920s and 30s, called it the shadow and beneath it, the collective unconscious. The Buddha, 2,500 years ago, called it sankhara, the formations that arise before conscious thought. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, called it System 1, the fast, automatic processor that runs your life before you ever enter the room. And the Stoics, in ancient Greece and Rome, called it prohairesis, the impression that shapes your judgment before you know you've made one. 5 frameworks, 5 languages, centuries apart, 1 mechanism. So here is what I want to do with you. I'm not going to ask you to believe anything. I'm going to set these 5 witnesses side by side and ask one question: why do minds separated by 25 centuries, with no contact between them, keep falling into the same place. Because one person describing the inside of the mind is a belief, two is a coincidence, but five independently. Across that much time, in that many languages, is something closer to a law. But first, the biology. Because once you see the machine for yourself, the witnesses stop sounding like mysticism and start sounding like five people describing the same fact. Let's look at what's actually happening inside your brain, not as philosophy, but as biology. In 1949, a Canadian psychologist named Donald Hebb published a book called The Organization of Behavior. Inside it was a single sentence that became the most important rule in all of learning theory when one neuron repeatedly takes part in firing another. The connection between them grows stronger. It was later shortened into a phrase you've probably heard: neurons that fire together, wire together. But Hebb wasn't being poetic. He was describing a physical process. Every thought you think travels along a chain of neurons, communicating across tiny gaps called synapses. Fire the same chain repeatedly, and those synapses strengthen. The threshold to fire them drops. The chain becomes the path of least resistance, and what once took conscious effort becomes automatic. This is Hebbian plasticity. It is the mechanism behind every habit, every skill, every reaction you have ever had. It is why you don't think about how to walk. It is why a pianist's fingers move before intention. And it is why your deepest patterns, your fears, your assumptions, your default reactions feel like they happen to you, instead of because of you. In 2004, a neuroscientist named Bogdan Dragansky tested this in a way you can almost see. He scanned the brains of people who had never juggled, taught them to juggle over 3 months, then scanned them again. Their brains had physically changed. Gray matter had increased in the regions responsible for visual and motor coordination. Their brains had grown new tissue to hold the skill. Let that land. A practice, repeated over time, changed the physical structure of the brain. Now here is what most explanations skip. Hebbian plasticity is not selective. It does not care whether the pattern helps you or destroys you. It does not distinguish between I am capable and I am unworthy. The brain wires around whatever fires repeatedly. That is not a metaphor. It is a structural fact. And this is where Libet's discovery becomes more than a philosophical puzzle. If your brain initiates the action before you are conscious of it, then something has to determine which action gets initiated. The answer is already sitting in the wiring, shaped by every repeated thought, every rehearsed emotion, every assumption you have ever held. The subconscious makes the call first. The conscious mind receives the result and calls it a decision. So now you have the machine. Hebb gave us how it is built. Libet gave us when it fires. Now watch 5 people who never had either word describe this same machine, each from their own doorway, across 25 centuries. The first witness was a mystic. Neville Goddard taught that the secret wasn't thinking, it was feeling. He wrote, "Your desires are not subconsciously accepted until you assume the feeling of their reality. For only through feeling is an idea subconsciously accepted." He didn't have the word synaptic. But look at what he was describing: repeated emotional experience strengthening a pathway until it becomes the subconscious default. Hebb said neurons that fire together, wire together. Goddard said feeling impresses the subconscious. Same process, one described at the cellular level, the other at the level of lived experience. And his practice was precise. Before sleep, when the brain drops into a theta-dominant state, and the critical filter of the prefrontal cortex goes quiet, Enter the feeling of the wish already fulfilled. Felt, not imagined. What he could not have known is that sleep is exactly when the brain consolidates the neural patterns activated during the day. The feeling you rehearse as you fall asleep is the pattern your brain reinforces while you rest. He called it the law of assumption. Neuroscience calls it sleep-dependent memory consolidation. 2 languages, 1 mechanism. He worked from the inside, alone with his own attention, a continent and a worldview away. Another man was mapping the same territory from the shadows. The second witness was a psychiatrist. Carl Jung spent decades mapping what lies beneath awareness. He described the shadow everything repressed, denied, or never integrated, and he insisted it operates autonomously, outside conscious control. It does not wait for permission. It acts. It projects. It shapes your reactions before you know you are reacting. He was describing automatic neural processing, the fast, subcortical route that runs from the amygdala before the prefrontal cortex is even involved. When anger arrives fully formed, when fear appears before you have finished reading the situation, that signal has bypassed your thinking brain entirely. The reaction fires first. The explanation comes after, and you sign it as if you had chosen it. Libet measured that gap in milliseconds. Jung had been watching it in dreams for 30 years. Same structure. And 25 centuries before Jung opened a notebook, a man sat beneath a tree and watched the same event happen in real time. The third witness was a monk. In Buddhist psychology, sankhara means the mental formations, the conditioned impulses of thought, emotion, and intention that arise before conscious awareness. The Buddha taught that these are not chosen. They surface automatically, shaped by past conditioning. And they are the primary force that drives action. That is the readiness potential, described from the first-person perspective. He needed no EEG. He sat still long enough to watch the mind generate an impulse before the eye claimed ownership of it. And the practice he prescribed, mindfulness, we now understand as the strengthening of the prefrontal cortex's capacity to observe and regulate the automatic subcortical response. It does not stop the impulse. It builds the pause between the impulse and the action. The ancient word was vipassana, clear seeing. The modern term is attentional control. Same mechanism, same result. He found it in silence. A modern Nobel laureate would later confirm it with data. The fourth witness was a scientist. In 2011, Daniel Kahneman described 2 systems. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, effortless. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical, and tiring. System 1 makes thousands of decisions every day without your conscious involvement. It reads the room before you walk in, finishes the sentence before you hear it, judges a stranger in under 1/10 of a second. And here is what he demonstrated. System 1 is not always right. It runs on shortcuts and biases it absorbed without your permission. But it feels right, because it arrives in consciousness already formed, wrapped in certainty. The hundreds of documented biases, confirmation bias, negativity bias, availability bias, are not flaws in your thinking. They are features of the system that runs before you do, which is exactly what Goddard meant when he said assumption feels like fact. What Jung meant by projection. What the Buddha meant when he said the untrained mind is carried by its formations like a leaf on a river. Long before any of them, in the courtyards of Rome, there was already a word for the gap inside that current. The fifth witness was a Stoic. The Stoics named the space between an impression and your assent to it proheresis. Something happens. The mind throws up an automatic verdict, a judgment, an emotion, an impulse, and between the impression and the response, they taught, there is a gap. And in that gap lies your only true freedom. Epictetus wrote, "It is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things." He was describing the same circuit Libet measured. The impression arrives first. The conscious judgment follows. And if you have not trained the pause, the judgment simply ratifies whatever the impression delivered. Modern neuroscience maps it exactly. The amygdala fires. The prefrontal cortex receives the signal, and if it is strong enough, it can inhibit the automatic response and initiate a deliberate one. If it is not, the automatic response becomes the action, and the conscious mind writes the justification afterward. The Stoics called the training prososche attention. Neuroscience calls it prefrontal inhibition training. Same practice. 5 witnesses. Now put them side by side. 5 frameworks. Neville Goddard, writing in 1944. Carl Jung, Between the World Wars, the Buddha, teaching 2,500 years ago. Daniel Kahneman, publishing in 2011. The Stoics, practicing in ancient Greece and Rome. Almost no documented contact between them. Different centuries, different languages, different tools, lecture halls, dreams, silence, data, a courtyard. These were not borrowed ideas passed down a single line. They were independent investigations, conducted from different angles, arriving at the same conclusion. The conclusion is this: you are not the author of your first thought. You are the recipient of it. The thought arises from a system that has been shaped by every previous thought you have ever entertained, every emotional state you have ever rehearsed, every assumption you have ever accepted as true. Let that land not because it sounds profound, but because it is mechanically accurate. The readiness potential fires half a second before you know what you're going to do. The prediction signal appears 7 seconds before you become aware of your decision. Your brain has already calculated the response based on the wiring you have built, and your conscious experience is the notification. This sounds like a loss of agency, but it is the opposite. If every automatic reaction is the product of prior conditioning, then changing the conditioning changes the reaction. The mechanism that produced the pattern is the same mechanism that can dissolve it and rebuild it. Hebb again, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is not a prison sentence. This is the instruction manual. Every time you consciously choose a different thought, every time you feel the feeling of the outcome before the evidence arrives, every time you find the pause between the impression and the response, you are literally remodeling the synaptic architecture that will produce your next automatic reaction. Goddard called it living in the end. Hebb called it long-term potentiation. Jung called it integrating the shadow. The Buddha called it unbinding the sankharas. Kahneman called it engaging System 2 until the new response becomes System 1. The Stoics called it strengthening proheresis. 5 different vocabularies for the same practice, grounded in the same biology. And once you see this, you can't unsee it. The explanation doesn't stay in your mind. It settles into your body. One honest word before we go inward, because this is where these videos usually start lying. Libet's experiment is real, but its full meaning is still debated by serious people. So hold it as a strong clue, not a closed verdict. And this is not the law of attraction. No one is telling you a feeling bends the outside world to your wishes. that stays a metaphor. What is not metaphor is the part with evidence under it. The pathway that fires repeatedly is the one your brain strengthens. And the pause you practice physically changes how you respond. Goddard's feeling creates "your world" is best heard as an old, accurate description of how you condition the world inside you. The only world any of these five were ever actually looking at. We keep the mechanism. We keep the metaphor in its place. So let's use the mechanism, not as theory, as direct investigation, right now. If you're in a place where you can, let your eyes close. If not, just soften your gaze. Take one breath, not to fix anything, not to calm down, just to arrive. Now bring to mind one pattern you'd like to be free of. Not the biggest one. A reaction that feels automatic, the fear that arrives before reason. The assumption that has been running you longer than you've noticed. Don't argue with it. You can't out-logic a pathway. Just see it for what the five of them told you it is. Not a flaw in your character. Not proof of anything broken in you. A synaptic root, worn deep by repetition. Something you learned, which means it is not who you are. Let that land. You are not the pattern. You are the one noticing it. Now, gently, without forcing, ask yourself if this pattern were already resolved. What would that feel like? Not what would it look like. What would it feel like in your chest, in your shoulders, in your breath? Let that feeling be there. Not dramatic. Just present. And as you rest in it, here is what is actually happening, said honestly. You are activating a different neural ensemble. You are sending a signal down a different route. This is synaptic reconsolidation, the same Hebbian remodeling that every tradition described in its own language. You are not rewriting your brain in a single minute. No one can. You are laying down the first faint signal on a new pathway. But every route that is now a highway started exactly this faint. That is the whole secret the five of them were circling. The mystic called it assuming the feeling. The monk called it clear seeing. The Stoic called it the gap. The scientist called it engaging System 2 until it becomes System 1. 5 names. One quiet act returning, again and again. Not as a demand, but as a steady presence, to the pathway you would rather travel. So take one more breath. Return to that feeling, the pattern already softening, already loosening its grip. Let it be subtle. Let it be simple. Let it feel almost familiar. What you are doing right now is not imagination. It is neural priming. And your attention, this quiet, steady presence, is the tool that shapes it. The mechanism always listens. Now, go back to where we started. The promise you made, the button they know exactly how to push. The next time it happens, and it will, something can be different. Not because you tried harder. You've always tried hard. That was never the problem. It can be different because when the sharp feeling rises, and the reaction starts to fire before you've decided anything, you'll recognize it. There it is. The pathway. And in that half second, the 5 of them spent their lives pointing at the gap between the impulse and the act. You'll have something you didn't have before. Not control. Not yet. Just awareness. The quiet, unhurried noticing that the impulse is not in order. That the worn road is not the only road. That you can let this one pass and lay down a single faint step on a different one. That's all it takes to begin. Not force, awareness. You didn't change anything. You just became aware. And that changed everything. This is conscious shift.